Okay, today I want to talk about a new add-on that I am creating for Blender. This is called Aether, and it's a material authoring add-on. So the way you can grab this right now is just go to the GitHub. I'll link it in the description and download this zip. Right now it's version 1.0.11. By the time you're seeing this version might update, and I always keep legacy builds in this builds folder if you want to revert to a specific version. But all you have to do is navigate to this zip and download it. This is probably the most ambitious add-on that I've ever tried to tackle, and there's a lot of testing that I need to do before I actually submit this and some code cleanup. But anyway, after you have that downloaded from GitHub, you can go to Edit Preferences and Install from Disk. Find that download that you grabbed from GitHub, select that whole zip file, and click Install from Disk. What this will give you now is a panel in your 3D viewport called Aether, and it gives you a bunch of options here. So this add-on is super involved, and the reason I am creating this is to try to create an alternative for myself outside of Adobe's Substance Designer and Substance Painter to do high quality materials for game engines. So I'm going to try to start off simply and explain some of the thought process, and then I'll get into some more nuanced examples as we go. So I'm in a fresh Blender scene. I'm just going to go and delete everything and add a new cube. From here, I'm going to set up a new Aether scene, which is kind of like a material authoring scene. I'm going to name it Demo Scene, and we're going to select our cube as the target object and just click this button to create Aether Scene. So you can see this did a lot of things on that click. It actually added a new workspace called Aether. It added 2 3D viewports. This is kind of a preview viewport. And this will show our UV layout. Also opened a shader editor down here. And the first thing I'm going to do is center this viewport on the camera by pressing 0. And I'm going to set this scene into material preview mode. Now you can see by default the whole screen turns white. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but this is because of some automatic compositing setup that already happened. So we can turn the compositor to disabled in viewport for now. This left-hand version, you can see we have a cube, but it's pink right now, which is telling us that we have no maps rendered for this object. So what we're basically doing here is rendering top-down onto a simulated UV layout. You can see in this viewport that I actually have a camera floating above a UV layout of the object. And this is created with a geometry node group. So this is actually the same mesh as this. So with the UV layout selected, I'm going to create a new material. And now open the Aether panel in the material window. Now we can click this button called Convert to Aether Master. And you can see this gives us a different shader than our typical principled BSDF shader. This is a special shader that will allow us to do some cool things. So now we need to decide what kind of maps we want to render. I don't have too many presets right now, but I'll set it to PBR default, which gives us a base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and opacity map. And now when I render all maps, once this is finished, if it doesn't update, you can double tap tab and it'll update. And you can see in my preview, I now have this white cube, which is reflecting our actual base color here that I set in our Aether master node group. And kind of the magic of this is I can set this to whatever I want. If I make the base color blue and I make it metallic, and then I click render all maps again, you'll see that the preview updates to be now a metallic blue cube. But this isn't very impressive right now. We're not really doing too much. So say you wanted to add some detail onto this cube, and I want, say, like a decal of Suzanne the monkey. So I'm going to add Suzanne into the scene here, right in the 3D view on top of my UV layout. I'm going to add a subdivision surface and shade it smooth. And now I'm going to add that same material. Let's actually call this base mat for my base material. And you can see Suzanne here is the same exact color as that cube. And if we look in our camera view, you actually can't even see it unless I select it. Now you might have noticed this texture output panel. And here we can actually toggle which AOV we're viewing currently in this viewport. So it's on the base color right now, but if I swap this to normal, you can see that now we can see Suzanne as a normal decal on top of our cube. If I switch this to roughness or metallic, you also don't really see Suzanne. If I switch it to ambient occlusion though, now we can see we're getting actual ambient occlusion of that 3D geometry on top of the UV map. If I didn't want this, I can just move Suzanne up 1 unit and it won't capture that ambient occlusion anymore. Or I can also change the slider inside of the Aether master node group in the shader. I can turn that geometry ambient occlusion mix to 0 if I don't want that. For now, I'll leave it on, but I'll move it back a little bit so we get a little bit tighter ambient occlusion around here. And I am going to render all maps again. And once that finishes rendering, you can see I have a really nice normal decal of Suzanne on this cube. And you might be wondering what this material set actually looks like. If you click this folder icon here, you'll be able to see all of the maps that actually rendered. And actually, if we shift click it, it'll open it in your system browser. So if we look at base color, it's going to be completely blue because this is the UV layout as base color and it's infilled all the way to the edges with the color. If I look at the normal map, it looks exactly like our top-down view with that infill spreading it into the corners. So you might be seeing how this could be useful. Say I wanted a stripe across the cube. I don't need to paint that stripe. I could, but in this system, I can just add a plane, scale it down to the size that I want, and create a new material. I can convert this into an Aether material. And if I wanted it to be a white stripe, just like this, we know that that stripe will go around vertically right here when I render. So after that's rendered, you can see we have our stripe. And in a similar way to what I did with Suzanne, we could just add a little bit of a bevel onto this. Now this geometry, since it's rendered, you don't really need to pay attention to topology or your polygon count or anything. It'll render as you see it. So it might make more sense if I'm editing in a normal view here. And we can just scale this object however we want. I'm going to add a little crossbar across this cube. And let's say we want to make it metallic. and with a little bit more of a gray base color. If we click this button that says Set to Default, this will give us kind of an approximated view. Obviously, it's still 3D geometry, but if we look through the camera, this can give us kind of a visualization of what that final map will look like. I think this is just called 2D View in Substance Painter. It's kind of similar to that. And again, we can always toggle through these options. So now when I render, you'll see I have kind of this nice banded metal going across my UVs. So this is a super simple implementation of this. And let's get a little more complex. So instead of a cube, let's actually use Suzanne herself. I'll do the same thing here where I add subdivision surface. I'm going to actually apply it this time and shade smooth. Now I'm going to do the same thing in the scene setup tab, only I will target Suzanne.01. I'll actually rename it to monkey, and we'll name this demo 2. I'll create another scene setup, and you can see we have her UVs here now, and the same thing with the preview. So if I add another material, convert it to Aether master, and then just so we have a baseline, let's set this to PBR and render our maps. So now we have a baseline of these maps on Suzanne. Now if I wanted to add something like an image, like a texture, say we want this to be a scratched metal material. I have a bunch of seed images I've created already. So let's take one like scratches and connect this into base color. Since this is being projected on the UVs by default, we know we're going to get UV seams and some stretching across this. So I'm going to render my map so you can see what I'm talking about here. Across the top of the head, you can clearly see a UV seam. And generally, we don't like this in material authoring for specific objects. And one way around this is I'm going to navigate back to my main scene, and I'm going to drop down this source map baking option. So I'll select the monkey as my target and just click Bake Source Maps. Baking source maps is kind of like in Substance Painter, you can start a project. It'll say something like Bake All Maps. This will give you that same set of maps that Substance Painter uses for its smart materials. So now with those source maps baked, I'm going to go back into my demo scene for Suzanne. And in the material editor, now I'll have this panel that says import source maps, detected source map folders for monkey. You just click this monkey button. This will add a node group with a bunch of image textures. We can use this as basically a triplanar or box projection around this object, but we can't just set this to box because the mesh that we're texturing, that it is registering in the viewport when it renders, is flattened. So what we do is use the position vector and normal vector that are created from the source maps, and all we have to do is select our image texture and click this Instance Triplanar Group button. Now connect the result into our base color, and we can look in the UV view. I'm going to scale it up so it's closer to what we originally had. And I'll add a mapping node just to shift this around a little bit. So now this might look a little distorted in the UVs themselves, but if I render everything, you can see on the 3D model that now that UV seam is completely hidden. If you're just using, say, a classic noise texture, you'll see that this is 3D by default. So that means it's kind of like a volume texture, and it'll texture over your mesh proportionally to the mesh's position. But again, we don't want to use actual position as in like geometry position. This would be the flattened geometry, and we'd have the same issue with UV seams. So we can use this position vector output from our source maps, plug it into the noise texture, and then plug the noise into base color. So if you want to go completely generative or procedural, you can use noise textures, any kind of generative texture inside of Blender that allows 3D. So that's kind of the approach of how I like to handle tackling these UV seams and making seamless textures across a model. While I have this noise texture set up, I'm going to go over detail normals in geometry. So we can actually use displacement as detail normals. So I'm just going to hook up this noise texture directly into bump instead of into my base color. So if we switch this to our normal view, now you can see I have some bump going on in the texture where our noise used to be. If I go back to base color, obviously it's all gray now because I have nothing plugged into this base color. But if I swap this back to normal, you can see I have basically detail normals. And it's super important that you remember to connect this displacement because that's what's actually driving these normals. And we can play with the strength here in this bump strength. You could also, I don't know, edit the scale of this. You could multiply this value to get some variation. You could ramp this in a color ramp to get more precise variation, whatever you want to do here. And I could also split this at this point, drive it through another color ramp. Let's make it like red and orange, and pass this into our base color. So I'm basically trying to show here that you can do whatever you want in this material setup and kind of set it up like your typical principled BSDF shader, and then when you render, you get a nice set of maps that you can use in your game engine or wherever you want. Might be worth noting that I only have OpenGL normal exports right now. You'd have to flip that Y channel if this is going into Unreal Engine right now. And like I said earlier, I don't have very many presets here, but I'd like to flush this out with major game engines and typical exports, kind of like Substance Painter does. You can always go into this list and remove or add any specific maps that you want. You're limited right now with the types of maps that you can have, although I did add a custom map. That map will export, but it won't actually preview onto your mesh. So here's a little bit more of a complex object that I use this system on. You can see that some of this is geometry and some of this is the UVs themselves. So I'm actually using geometry to define different areas that I want different materials in. You can see these little screws here were added as actual geometry, but some of this underlying detail is actually baked from the high poly mesh. We can see that if I swap to the normal map, and I'll isolate just that UV layer. So this is all not geometry, it's just that baked normal map. And you can see I kind of have some errors here in the bake process, and I've cleaned that up by adding my own geometry over this, added different details like other screws, and I've defined areas that weren't defined with UV maps. And this is kind of the result. It's not I wouldn't say it's 100% complete, but you can see that the materials can get fairly simple to more complex, and they can just get more complex from here. This example is a little bit messy, but you can see just how complex we can get. This is defining a material for wooded slats, like a stylized wooded slats material that's being applied to this crate object. So all the detail you see here is being driven completely by this material system. I know using this method might not be everyone's preferred workflow, and there is definitely a lot of value in learning Substance Designer and Substance Painter because they're industry standard. I'm making independent work and I have freedom with my workflow at my job, so it's super beneficial for me to not have to pay a subscription just to get some material authoring tools that I knew I could create myself. I'm really interested if this appeals to anyone else. I'll be doing a lot more videos on this add-on as it develops, and I'll be continuing to support my existing add-ons too. So check out my other videos on those and be sure to like and subscribe for more content on this.